Hi everyone, I'm Tali, this is Farrell and we are Bored of It, and welcome to our buyer's guide for the Undaunted series of games. Now this is a brilliant two-player head-to-head deck building series of games set across different theatres of conflict during World War II. And we both rated the Undaunted series as one of our top 10 games of all time. So we thought, why not tell everyone what is exactly so special about this surprisingly approachable and affordable series of games.
If you haven't seen our buyer's guides before, we tend to keep things factual because the point is to help you make an informed decision till the very end, which is where we actually give our opinions on all of this. But what we're going to tell you is what Undaunted is. We're going to tell you how to play Undaunted, what content is available for Undaunted, and what you should know before buying, with finally wrapping up on our opinions on each and every game or expansion in the series. And in terms of full disclosure, we received a review copy of Undaunted North Africa from the publisher Osprey Games. They were also supposed to send us Battle of Britain review copy, but they did not. So we ended up buying it ourselves so we can make the video along with everything else besides North Africa. If you find this helpful, please consider subscribing because it really helps us as a channel to grow, and then we can make more buyer's guides like this, which, as we can see from views, are people's favorite videos. And also just know that everything is timestamped, so you can jump to the bits that are relevant for you.
The Undaunted series is a series of World War II based two-player deck building and dice chucking head-to-head games. Each one is set in a different World War II conflict using the Undaunted system. However, with each game, there is some twist on the scenario design or maybe some new mechanisms added to each installment to build upon or alter what came before. Each game in the series is designed by Trevor Benjamin and David Thompson and published by Osprey Games.
Every game of Undaunted will start the same way. You'll pick a scenario to play, go to the scenario book, and that will show you how to set up the map for that game. It will also tell you how to construct your decks and which cards to leave in reserve to be recruited later on into your deck. Each card generally will represent a soldier, and soldiers are going to be grouped by type into squads. Then squads will have physical tokens on the map representing where they are and where they're going to take actions from. There are other types of cards, such as command cards, which do not have physical presence on the board, but represent command, essentially. So these might let you recruit new cards into your deck, they might let you draw more cards, or take actions with cards you've already played. Each round, both players will draw 4 cards from their deck. Now, these cards have a number on them called the initiative value, and both players will select one of their cards simultaneously and then reveal. Whichever player played a card with the highest initiative value gets to go first. And a turn in Undaunted is a full turn, so that player will then play all of their cards, followed by the other player who then plays all of their cards. And both cards used for the initiative bid, they will be discarded, so you don't get to play those. Most cards in the game will have a number of actions available, although you can only pick one of them per card you play. And commonly, you'll begin a scenario out by using the scout action a lot. This allows you to move your scouts and scout terrain where you haven't been before. And this is required because until terrain is scouted, you are not able to move other units like riflemen or machine gunners closer to the objectives or whatever other reason you might want to move them. Now, when you take the scout action, you also take Fog of War cards into your deck. And these are essentially dead cards with low initiative value, used entirely to clog up your hand and make things more difficult for you at the worst possible time. Units often have actions specific to themselves, such as riflemen being able to capture control points, something often needed to win a scenario. But this being a war game, the action you're likely to use the most will be attack. And the attack action on the card will tell you how many dice you roll. You'll roll them, and you'll see if you get a hit. Now, there's a quite clever and easy to read system to figure out how likely you are to get a hit, and it adds a lot of tactical impetus to the game. Essentially, you're going to pick a target. You're going to look at their base defense. You're going to add that to the value that the tile gives them, because there might be a cover bonus, could be 0, could be 2, and then you're going to see how far away they are. And you add all this together and you'll end up getting a value you need to equal or exceed to get a hit. If you get a hit, the owner of that unit has to remove them from the deck. And first, they will have to remove them from their current hand, if they have one and they're in there. Then, if they're not in there, they'll take them from their discard pile, and if they're not in their discard pile, they'll take them from their deck. If they're not in any of those places, then they have to remove the combat token from the map, and that unit, or squad even, is out of the game. They can't recruit anymore, even if they had cards to recruit. Well, of course, there's a lot of units and actions we haven't covered. Generally, what you're going to be doing is moving your squads around the map, shooting at the other player, and trying to complete objectives. These objectives could be a variety of things, with each game adding more varied and different objectives, but some basic ones might be capture a certain number of control points, defeat all enemy riflemen, or have one unit escape by moving to a specific tile and then moving off the map.
To date of this video, there are 3 small box Undaunted games: Undaunted Normandy, Undaunted North Africa, and Undaunted Battle of Britain. Then there's Undaunted Stalingrad, which is a larger legacy-style campaign game, which is completely replayable. Then the final piece of content is Undaunted Reinforcements, which is an expansion for both Normandy and North Africa, which adds solo play, some new units, and scenarios. Undaunted Normandy was the first game in the series and is the least asymmetric. This charts the battle across Normandy after D-Day between the Americans and the Germans. The cards available to each side are essentially the same, and often the objective is pretty similar. Then there's the sequel, North Africa, which is set between Britain's long-range desert group and the Italians in North Africa. This throws vehicles into the mix as well as asymmetry. The units available to each side are pretty different and the objectives are unique, which means each player has to approach each scenario differently to have a chance of success. That said, the core gameplay is essentially the same, aside from some minor rules additions such as the vehicles. Then came the expansion, Undaunted Reinforcements, for both games. This is a modular expansion which comes with a storage box inside which can store the components from both of the previous games. And the modules also include a solo play mode for every scenario in Normandy and North Africa, a 4-player team game mode, some alternative units, some new units, and some new scenarios for both games. It is required that you have at least one of the previous games in the series in order to play this expansion with, although clearly having both is better. It should also be noted the solo module was designed by David Sertzi and David Digby. Next came the big box replayable campaign game Undaunted Stalingrad. This takes you through the conflict between the Soviets and the Germans, which is the Battle of Stalingrad, and will last a variable number of games depending on who wins and loses each scenario, as there's a branching campaign with minor narrative elements. Whilst generally sticking to the Undaunted system, it does try a new way of controlling vehicles compared to North Africa, and also introduces new tactical options and new units which weren't there in the previous base games. Most of its innovations and improvements on prior games come in the form of the legacy elements and the creation of immersion. What happens in one scenario leads into the next. If you bomb your opponent's stronghold into oblivion, you might just find yourself occupying that same stronghold in the next scenario, having little protection for your troops. You'll permanently be losing soldiers from your deck and they'll get replaced with poorly trained recruits, or the heroes of battle can get promoted, granting you better versions of themselves. You'll constantly be unlocking new units and tactical options based on the outcome of the previous scenarios.
Then we have the newest game in the series, Undaunted Battle of Britain. This takes Undaunted to the skies and simulates the aerial Battle of Britain between the Luftwaffe and the RAF. Although the core is Undaunted, this has more changes than ever before. You no longer have square map tiles, they're all hexagonal. Your squads are now airplanes and they're directional. Every time you take an action, they have to move because airplanes can't sit still. And your firing range is directional, as would be in a real airplane. Now, while the core is the same, the pace and the feel is rather different to previous entries in the series, because this game is simulating aerial combat, dogfights, bombing runs, you name it. The first thing we'd say that you need to know is, despite the apparent stodgy theme, Undaunted series is extremely approachable and incredibly engaging, so much so that even people who wouldn't be interested in war games should give it a go, because they might be surprised by how much they like it. As one example, when I brought this home, I can tell you that Tally internally groaned upon looking at it that she had to play yet another war game, and now it's in her top 10 games of all time. The designers deserve such massive respect for the amount of tension and drama they inject into each and every scenario, yet making this all happen in a system that is very rules-light, very approachable, easy to understand, and quick to play. It's been such a delight watching people who, on the surface, would never have any interest in this type of game if you just described it very dryly, having the time of their life playing and being fully engaged with Undaunted. In our opinion, it's definitely worth having more than one Undaunted game, although how many you get should directly relate to your enjoyment of the Undaunted system. They do each innovate or expand or add new mechanisms which are worth exploring, because they just shake up that formula a bit. But that's not saying you shouldn't just stick with one game, because you get quite a lot of content for not a large price tag in any of the Undaunted games, bar Stalingrad, which is more expensive. You're going to get 10 to 12 scenarios, but then remember, there's two sides in this box, and each one in the scenario will have its own objectives and its own deck setup, which means it's more like 20 to 24 scenarios, assuming that you just don't want to replay some. And what's great is Undaunted plays in a good time, 30 to 90 minutes, usually on the lower side of that, and we're often playing multiple scenarios within one session when we get it on the table, just because of that and how easy it is to set up and play. Now, one thing worth noting is you can only play Undaunted games 2-player unless you have the Reinforcements expansion. This allows you to play either of these two games solo, and you can play any scenario and any side solo with this expansion. And it also adds some new scenarios for 4-player team games. Moving on to negatives that you should be aware of. The first would be the theme. It's a theme that will bother some people. And on top of that, it has you in the games play as the Axis powers, which might be distasteful to others. Moving on to gameplay, the biggest one is that combat is driven by dice rolls. And we're not saying that's a negative, we're just saying that some people may find that a negative. For us, it's very tactical, and generally you roll so much over a game that it balances out. But we can't argue that you can lose a scenario through a couple of bad dice rolls. So, something to be aware of. And on top of that, for people who are iffy about luck in this kind of game, you also have the card draws from your deck. And I can tell you, you're going to have a very different game if you draw 4 Fog of War cards in one hand, or 1 Fog of War card every other hand from your deck. But generally, you're, as I said, rolling so much and drawing so much that it balances out over a game. The scenarios play in less than an hour, and usually we're playing multiple across one session. So for us, it's very hard to ever feel aggrieved by this luck and randomness, particularly because you have some control over it tactically with the dice rolling and deck building wise with what you draw.
Unsurprisingly, considering we've mentioned it multiple times, where we rank the Undaunted series, we think it's bloody brilliant. There are so many smart and engaging mechanisms which masterfully build tension. The bid for initiative is always very tense and never an easy decision. And the fact that your best cards have the highest initiative is a delightfully evil design choice, because you constantly have to weigh up whether you want to discard it with the hope of going first, or keep it to play and maybe let your opponent go first. And if they do and get a few hits on you, you may not even get the chance to play that card at all, or even take a turn. We've said it time and time again, but we really think the best games are those that constantly present you with tough decisions, and few games do it better than Undaunted.
The fact that there's so much space to be tactical, yet every combat goes down to the roll of a dice, means that the game is always dramatic and it's always an excruciating die roll. You just have so much tension in this. It's stressful in the best way, but one thing that's not stressful is the deck building. Because what each scenario of Undaunted is doing is it's saying, here's your objective, go about it. And what players love is having the ability to decide how they go about an objective they've been given. And deck building is such a great way to do that because they're doing it through managing their deck, who they recruit, who they maybe take out of their deck. And it's just such a kind of clean and nice system to engage with. Another thing that we really enjoy is how each game of Undaunted progresses from the first scenario to the last. Because they're going to start out with using only the most basic units in a small little battle, basically a punch up in a field. And it progresses up until, scenario 11, 12, where you've got almost every unit in the game at your disposal. You've got this big map in front of you. There's all kinds of objectives and things going on. You have all these tactical options. And it's just such an epic experience that has built in a really nice manner up and up and up. So let's go through each of these boxes and talk about what we think. We'll start with our favourite, Undaunted Stalingrad. And this is, as we said in our review, the Undaunted system turned up to 11. Essentially, it takes what was great about the other Undaunted games and kind of makes it more immersive, more engaging, because it puts it into a campaign where how you play out one scenario is going to affect the next couple of scenarios. If you decide to go Scorched Earth and bomb Tally out of that building, then I'm going to be in that building next game and I'm going to have no cover when she comes back at me. Things like that. The fact that you will have soldiers throughout the entire campaign only to lose them just before the end because they die. It's really sad, and then you get like a crappy little reserve. There's just a lot of great stuff. It adds some really interesting units, tactical decisions. It alters the vehicles from North Africa in a way that I think we both prefer.
Yeah.
And it just gives so much.
However, it is the most expensive and rules-heavy entry into the series. It's about double the price of the other Undaunted base games. So we'd only really recommend starting with this if you're 100% about the Undaunted system. If you are new to the system, then we'd recommend starting with either Normandy or North Africa, and whichever one you pick is really going to depend on what you prefer.
Yeah, so you have Normandy, which is arguably the most simplistic, has the kind of most basic units, the most basic scenario structure, and the least asymmetry. So it's a great learning experience because you're both going through the same thing essentially, and often have the same type of objective, just from a different angle and a similar starting setup. So it's good to learn together and go through. Whereas North Africa?
North Africa is a lot more asymmetric. You have the different vehicles, which, for me personally, I didn't get on board with too much. I didn't find them too sensible in the way that they kind of take damage and damage your units. So for me, I just prefer the kind of cleanness and simplicity of Normandy, but you prefer North Africa.
Yeah, I really enjoy the asymmetry because basically your entire decks are quite different, and the way that you have to attack the scenarios are quite different. I just think I really like this variety, to know that if I go through and play who Tally was, then I'll have a completely different experience while playing the same game.
Yeah.
But which one you want really is up to you.
Both good.
So then we have Reinforcements, the expansion to both of these games.
Yes. So there's the solo mode in this, which I believe you tried out, which we'll come back to maybe. And then a 4-player team game mode, which a lot of people didn't really take to, didn't really like, because you're essentially maybe getting like half the game because you just split the responsibilities between the team members. But we personally had a really fun time with it. Maybe it just depends on your group. Yeah. That could be definitely a consideration. But for us, we just enjoyed sharing Undaunted with our friends, essentially. So we were more than happy to kind of take half the game, as it were, you know, just for the sheer joy of sharing it with our friends and for them to really like playing as well. And I think one of our friends ended up actually getting it for themselves, which is always really cool.
Yeah, it's quite clearly a fun game, and even though you are dividing the responsibilities down, it's good to have fun with your friends.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's probably not worth buying reinforcements just for that. There is also the solo mode, which if you're a solo gamer would be the main reason to get this. Yeah. It lets you play any scenario in either of these two games as either side. And I played a few, and I was really, and I'm not a solo gamer, but I was really pleasantly surprised by how undaunted it felt. The decisions, the tactical decisions, the stress is all there, and they've done very clever system and very easily to manage.
Yeah, a good way to learn the systems, right? And to potentially improve your game for next time you play against a human opponent as well. Exactly,
that's a good point, because it even says, I think somewhere, that you can use what the opponent does to know the best way to go about that scenario, because that's how they've obviously designed it. Yeah. So you also get a bunch of new stuff. You get some new scenarios for both games. You get some new cards. You get some alternate units. But honestly, it's best to buy if you really want to play it solo, or if you've played both of these and you just want a little bit more. It's definitely a non-essential expansion, but it's nice to have. And you can put all the content in these two into here.
Yeah, so a bit of space saving as well, but yeah, not an essential buy for us.
Lastly, Battle of Britain.
So yeah, this is the most unique take on the system, let's say, because we're taking the system to the skies. It's all about aerial battles, and it is a little bit more fiddly and complex because of the way that you're moving planes, which really simulates the real life way a plane moves. You always have to kind of move on your turn. You can't stay in position because you'll drop out of the sky. And you also can't shoot your opponents if you're facing certain directions. So there's just a lot more to consider here, and a lot more to forecast how your moves in this turn is going to affect your moves in the next few turns, let's say. So you really have to be a lot more strategical, whereas I think with the other games you can really kind of take it turn by turn, have a bit of a master plan, but essentially you're just playing, you know, with the cards that you're dealt, whereas Battle of Britain, definitely a lot more tactical, and you have to make much more of a plan and kind of try and stick to it as best as possible.
It's a good way to put it. I think no Undaunted game has ever made me feel as smart and as clever as Battle of Britain, just because the way the scenarios are and the way the planes move, you look at them and you're like, oh, I could do this, or I could go this way, or I could try pin like this. There's just something different about it that really elevates the kind of tactical opportunities that were there before.
Yeah.
And it's something I've really enjoyed, because in the other games that were ground-based, you do just tend to kind of move towards an objective and fire at each other, right? Whereas here, there's a lot more going on.
Yeah.
But as you alluded to, the downside is there's so much more to keep in your head.
Yeah.
Because the fog of war cards, they work differently. It's more about if your two planes from the same squad are close to each other or not. So when you're moving, because you're like, oh, I can go and target this guy, and you move it away, and then that can harm you next round when you draw a card and suddenly you've got a fog of war.
Yeah, exactly.
So, or the fact that you have to move every time, and sometimes there's obstacles that will destroy your plane if you move into them. But if you don't realize that, because you're only thinking of the current turn, you can lose like an entire squad.
You have to position your plane in previous turns, and it's all about the direction even that they're facing. So it's very, very easy in Battle of Britain to make quite a big mistake.
Yeah.
Position yourself towards a barrage balloon, and if you're facing that direction, with most of the planes, you have to move and then you maneuver to face direction. So if you're facing towards the barrage balloon, you have to move, and then that's it. That's that plane gone. So much bigger implications of making mistakes.
Yeah. So coming to our final thoughts, basically, we obviously
love it.
We love the Undaunted system. We very, very much recommend it, even to people who think that it might not be for them just because of the theme. You might think it's dry, stodgy. Tally's proved that it's not. And obviously, hopefully we've helped you know which game you should get, which game's for you. You know what our favourites are. And it's such an enjoyable series that we've basically played every scenario of every game, more or less.
Yeah.
So we've played a lot of Undaunted.
We have played a lot of Undaunted.
So importantly, we really appreciate you watching and we hope it was helpful. Of course, ask us any questions you might have related to Undaunted down below. And if this was helpful or interesting, please subscribe, because it's the main way we measure growth and it will mean a lot to us, essentially. But thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.